today we are here to talk about design and to talk about typefaces specifically. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that. I'm going to adjust. The background music feels a little loud. To me that down just a smidge. Here we go. I like having it on because then it's not just me speaking in silence for an hour, but also I'm trying to get the balance right. So one of the things that I would say designers struggle with most, even like really capable designers who have been designing for years and years and years, one of the most challenging parts is choosing a font, choosing a typeface, right? And while a lot of typefaces might look similar at first glance, especially to the untrained eye, a closer look will quickly reveal that they all have lots of different quirks, lots of differences. They kind of have personalities, you know? Like a typeface can feel playful or serious or sexy or youthful or energetic. All of these kinds of things you can communicate, you can kind of feel in a typeface. And in the same way that we have attempted to kind of categorize all sorts of like human personalities, right? We've got things like the Myers-Briggs, we've got the Enneagram, like all those little tests you can take that put you into kind of boxes based on the way you think or the way that you act, hypothetically. We kind of do the same thing with typefaces, right? And again, that comes back to, we've talked about this here before on the stream, this desire to really put things in boxes, to categorize things, to make them easier for our brains to kind of break down and understand, right? And so a lot of times, I think when we're kind of talking about the like, why are there so many names for this? Why do we have to break all of this stuff down? Like, why are there 20 million typeface categories, right? It's just an attempt to try and organize the effectively unorganizable, right? We're just trying to make things make sense and give some words to kind of describe overarching themes and make things discussable, right? And I feel like that's something that a lot of folks kind of struggle with because like art or design, right, can feel very subjective. And so a lot of what we're trying to put words to can be really, really difficult to put words to. And sometimes the words that we give them are only kind of tangentially accurate, you know, like we get close, but we don't really capture it because it's hard to capture something that is entirely visual in this way. But we do our best. So that was a little tangent there on the difficulty of naming things in design. But what we're really talking about are typefaces, names of typeface categories, and kind of the ways that you can categorize and help choose between typefaces for your project, right? So there are kind of two ways in which we group typefaces, either by their kind of historical basis or by their actual look, the way that they physically appear, right? Historical, again, there's a lot of different typefaces and different typeface categories. So I'm going to try and kind of narrow this down to just talk about the ones that come up most often, right? Like the largest categories. Because these things you could really drill way down, and there's going to be all sorts of names and all sorts of descriptive words for all sorts of things. But I'm going to try and stick to the big ones, just to kind of give you the language to describe what you're looking at and have that conversation with someone else when you're trying to say, I think this needs to be more that, or I think it needs to be less this, or I think this would work better with X and not with Y, right? That's always kind of the goal of Dev by Design, is to just kind of give you the language to talk about this stuff. So first off, historical categories. First is Humanist. So Humanist typefaces are really based strongly in calligraphy, the kind of movements of the hand that are used to actually create the letter forms. It looks more like writing. It's less precise, right? So let me see. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. I haven't done this in a minute, so let's see if my computer remembers the... Yes. It did not. I was afraid it was going to tell me I didn't actually have sharing privileges. So we're going to take a quick peek. Humanist typefaces. Let's take a look at some images. Come on, images. There we go. So you're gonna see here that there's less kind of like perfect right angles. There's less kind of perfectly straight lines. There's going to be lots of like big open spaces within the counters. So for those of you that weren't here, I was going to say last week, but I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks ago when we talked about the anatomy of a typeface. The counter is the kind of closed part of a letter. So like in O's or D's or P's, like that kind of inside space, right? So your counters are going to be really large and open. It's going to feel, you know, it won't look literally like someone wrote it, but you'll see a little bit more humanity in these kinds of typefaces. They'll look a little bit more organic, you know? And so if we kind of look at these, right? So like, here's one, and you can see there's kind of differences in the thickness and thinness, right, of each kind of stroke. There's a lot of variation, especially like look in this K, right? You see it kind of start thinner and get wider, the same way that like if you were writing with an ink pen, you would see that change. Ditto here, right? Like we see this kind of, it's aligned on a baseline, but parts dip beneath the baseline, and there's thickness and thinness and imperfection. This eye has a little bit of a like, a little waver to it. It feels more like somebody wrote something, right? Another thing you'll often see in these are these kind of the terminals there, which again kind of speaks to that, like the way that, you know, if you were writing, the ink would kind of blot. It will feel more reminiscent of those kinds of movements, and that can be a good choice if you're looking for something that feels a little bit more relatable, that feels a little bit more human, frankly. Those are good choices. And when we're talking, by the way, about these historical categories, a lot of times the first kind of category breakdown that you hear when people talk about typefaces is serifs and sans serifs, right? So it's either serifs, where it's got, right, like these little guys, the little feet, right, the little pieces that come off each side of a letter, those are your serifs. And a sans serif will look more like this, right? It doesn't have those little feet. Humanist and all of these kinds of categories that we're talking about that are historical, they can apply to either one, right? A lot of times you will see more humanist serif fonts, again, because they feel like a little bit older. But as you can see here, like this is a humanist sans serif, and you still see some of those same trademarks, right? The thickness and thinness and the kind of more natural flow, right? It's a little bit more geometric, like your eyes are like a little bit more straightforward, but they've got that same like open counters, they've got the same natural angles, they've got the same thickness and thinness. So you'll kind of see those in both categories, right? Next, we're going to take a look at transitional. So the thing to keep in mind with transitional, right, is we're moving from humanist first, and then the kind of opposite of that is modern, which sounds a little silly, right? Because modern, they're not really terribly modern in the current sense. But transitional is kind of what happens in between. We're talking about moving through different like pieces of history, different trends, right? So with transitional typefaces, we kind of start to see the design move away from that like very human influence, but not abandon it entirely. It's kind of a more idealized version of those humanist typefaces, but now we have the technology available to create that kind of precision that was previously not really available when we were talking about like, you know, the kind of old metal type, or like trying to cast things for the first time. One of the biggest tells of transitional typefaces is the variation in stroke width within the letter forms, right? So like, yeah, here, the stroke contrast, right? Because we're able to get thinner thins. So Sorry, I got distracted because I switched back over and I saw a chat. From King Code. Interesting, my coding teacher messaged me this after reviewing my code. I like your code, even though it's a bit hard to follow. Thanks. From what I could tell, the idea sound you want to sit down and do a bit of design before things come to unwieldy. I'm not actually sure what this is in reference to. So, King of COD. I get the feeling this is maybe in the wrong place, because we're not actually talking about code today. We're talking about design, talking about typefaces. So, yeah, give me a little context, or, not. But anyway, transitional typefaces. We were talking about stroke contrast. Ooh, sorry. So you'll kind of see there's a really big difference here. We're able to create thinner thins that we weren't before. And so people start to really kind of lead into that. And you'll see, right, here's another transitional. And you can see kind of in the N's and in the S's, we get thinner and thinner than we used to be able to. However, we are seeing straight lines are able to get a little bit straighter. We're seeing a little bit more of that kind of geometric, like strict right angle kind of situation. Again, because we are able to now achieve that kind of precision, whereas historically they weren't. However, we have not entirely abandoned some of the humanist things. So you'll still see a lot of kind of rounding. You'll see a lot of kind of just softening of the edges. Right, so here's a good one. You're seeing, right, those really thin thins, especially kind of here, the O's and the P's, a lot in the like tails of the letters here, but we're still using those like kind of thicker ballpoint terminals here. We're still seeing some of the more gentle flows, the rounded corners when we're looking at some of this stuff, right? But cleaning it up a little bit, basically. Now, modern typefaces. So modern typefaces, kind of contrary to what the name might imply and the way we were talking about earlier, these actually date back to around like the 1700s, right? You can identify them because they kind of push that trend that we were seeing in transitional all the way to the extreme. They get super, super thin lines, right? And they've got a really strong kind of vertical emphasis. And you can see that they really no longer look like anything that a human writer could have possibly created by hand, right? Like they've kind of become a little bit more extreme, right? So Bodoni is kind of the poster child. And you can see lots of very strict vertical up and downs, lots of really little thin lines. Super big contrast, thicks and thins, lots of these kind of flourishes and little things that simply wouldn't have been possible, right? A lot of these, because I've searched modern, I'm just getting like random current fonts, which are not actually examples of actual modern typefaces. There we go. More of this kind of thing, right? They feel very thin, they feel very tall, they feel very precise in ways that we just weren't really able to achieve previously. Now, the other way that you can start to categorize typefaces, we've been talking about kind of the historical ways of doing it, humanist, transitional, modern. Now we're going to flip over and kind of look at stylistic categories. So these are ways of categorizing a typeface based on their style and their usage, as in how they physically look, not necessarily what point of history they were kind of coming from or what trend they were associated with. And as we talked about a little bit ago, serif typefaces are one of the most common ones, right? Serifs and sans serifs. We've talked about these a little bit, but just in case you have not popped in before, we're going to go ahead and do a recap, right? These are serif typefaces when they have these little feet, these little decorative lines that are kind of associated with them, right? So a serif typeface will have these little guys and a sans serif will not. So Serifs are going to confer a little bit more of a professional, kind of an old school feeling to your type. They're often associated with tradition, with legacy, with age, and often now with print design. If you're going to be writing really large blocks of text, like an ebook or an article or anything where there's just like text, a serif font is going to be a really good choice. Those serifs, those little lines that are, on that letter form, they create a more drastic and noticeable differentiation between all of the different letters. That makes it easier to read them than it does with sans serif fonts. So as you kind of skim over a page, as your eyes like jump through an article, you're able to read fast more easily. Sans serifs, on the other hand, are going to feel really clean and really modern and really sleek. They've become especially kind of ubiquitous in tech, right? So like, if you are a developer watching this, you have absolutely seen a sans serif typeface before. They are super, super common. They're a great choice for brands or for apps that want to look really young or trendy or cutting edge, very like digital. They tend to look very clean, so they can be really good choices for big header text, big logo text, anything that's going to be kind of like in your face. We see it a lot in logos for tech brands, right? So we're going to look up like whatever, Spotify. Yep, and Meta, and Netflix, right? All of those are going to have sans serif typefaces. Whereas if we were to go look up, I'm trying to think of something that would be a little bit more old-fashioned. So we're going to have a little bit of a swing and a miss here where I try to guess brands that are still using serif typefaces. So we'll see if anyone's still doing it. Maybe like Tiffany's. So yeah, so Tiffany and Company still using a serif, excuse me. You can see that, right? And so they're kind of leaning into that like legacy luxury brand, something that's been around for a long time. And they want to kind of make sure that you know that. What else? Probably a newspaper uses a serif font. So like maybe Wall Street Journal? Yeah. Absolutely. And the New York Times. They're still using their black letter logo. That's kind of cool. I didn't realize that. So, good excuse to talk about black letter. Black letter fonts are this kind of old style, right? That looks like a little bit thicker and very decorative, right? Also known as Gothic. Very commonly used like right when printing was still new, because it's super, super highly mimicked that kind of calligraphy that folks were used to in like handwritten books at the time. So it's super decorative. It's a hard one to use, right? Because when you look at it, they're not actually super legible. These have mostly kind of fallen out of favor, and you'll only see them. Now they would probably be categorized as like a display typeface, right? So display typefaces. Oops, display. Can't type. Display typefaces are going to be like really, really decorative in that same kind of way. They're going to be a little funky, they're going to be a little bit weird, and they're always going to be best used as a display font and never, ever, ever as your body copy. You don't ever want to set a whole page of text in something like this, right? They're incredibly distinctive, and there's lots of kind of subsets, right? Like black letter would fall under this. Trying to think of some other like common types that would be considered a subset of something like this. I don't know. I'll chew on it. Throw it in the chat if you got any other examples of a display typeface like this. But the point being, you should always kind of use them with caution, because they're gonna add a really huge burst of like uniqueness and personality and frankly like fun to your design, right? So like something like this will really catch your eye, and it's great as something kind of big, as a title, something to catch your eye and draw you in. But they don't tend to be very legible, right? Because they're kind of distinctive in this way. So, right, like this one, very cool, right? But kind of a struggle to actually read. Neat from a design standpoint, interesting visually, not necessarily the most effective, right? And some are going to be a little easier than others, right? This one's certainly easier to read. These get a little bit harder, right? Where the thins are so thin that you almost can't see them. But they're fun. They're meant to be fun. They're meant to draw your eye in. But I'd say this works really well. This little stuff down here, almost completely illegible. So you have to be very careful about where and how you use them. You don't want to use them too much because they can feel very overwhelming. You don't want to use them at small sizes, and you don't want to use them ever for like large blocks of text. It's even like, right, so like this one is just showing you, right, all of the different letter forms, and you can start to feel your eyes. Where did I click? Good lord. You can start to feel your eyes just glaze over, even as you're looking at it. You just kind of skim, and you stop seeing them as letters, and you just start seeing them as like objects, right? So if you were to do that with actual text, the same thing would kind of happen, and that's never really what you want. Next, and one of the ones that comes up a lot, script typefaces. These can also kind of like, in the Venn diagram, right? Script has a lot of overlap with a display typeface, but these are specific in that they are meant to mimic human handwriting. Some are going to be more stylized than others, in that some will look like literally something you could maybe have written, and some will look like if you were to abstract the idea of handwriting, right? So ones like this are a little bit closer. This certainly more so, right? Like these look like things you could hypothetically write. Some of these get fully into calligraphy, which certainly some people can write, but not everyone. And then we see things like this, right? Which you couldn't really write this. Maybe if you had like a lot of training for a specific pen, right? But for the most part, these are showing thicks and thins, or types of like emphasis that you wouldn't be able to do unless you were trained in this, right? Like this was your whole job. Whereas ones like this are gonna look more closely like actual handwriting. These, maybe not so much, right? We're seeing those kind of strong up and downs, some of the like precision that would not actually be possible for someone writing by hand. So there's a lot of kind of subcategories that are in here. But these are nice because they really add that level of humanity, that human touch back into your design. That's something that can be really difficult to achieve when you're designing on a computer, right? Like you get a lot of those right angles, you get a lot of that like very specific pixel perfect kind of thing, and that can be very nice. But sometimes you want something to feel a little bit more handmade, right? We want to evoke kind of a different feeling, a different energy. I'm gonna come back to this. I caught myself almost going off on a tangent, which y'all know that I love to do. But I'm gonna finish talking about script typefaces, and then I'm gonna come back to that idea of bringing in that human touch, right? So script typefaces. In the same way as a display font, you don't want to use these for like a whole block of copy. You don't want to set like a whole bunch of stuff in this. And you'll see this done. I feel like people are more likely to, frankly, abuse script typefaces than any other, because we kind of see them like maybe we wrote it ourselves, right? So even something like this, that's a lot of text to set in a script typeface. that's a lot to try and read. It's hard. It's like it's just a little overwhelming to our eyes, right? To try and distinguish all of this and make it make sense in our brains. I'm sure probably when you were a kid, you got like one of those birthday cards from your grandmother that was just full of looping cursive script, and you were just like, okay, this is gonna feel the same way. So script text you're gonna want to use for headers, subheaders, maybe like a pull quote, a small block of text. But the more you use it, like it's gonna feel really overwhelming, and it's not gonna be super easy to read. So these are great to kind of pull the eye in and kind of get people to pay attention, bring them to whatever you're working on, but they're not gonna be great for actually setting a lot of type. Now, the thing that I was almost jumping into earlier. We've talked a little bit before about the idea of trends in art and the idea of like the pendulum swinging back and forth. I think we were talking about it back when we were talking about like grids, right? And how the use of a grid system kind of goes in and out, right? Like things will be very strictly aligned to a grid and then we'll be like, no, forget it. I don't want to touch the grid anymore. I want things to be everywhere. I want this to feel organic and natural. And we get that same kind of back and forth, I would say, with like typefaces. One of the coolest things that we saw, right, was like probably early 90s-ish. Like computers were pretty newly accessible to everyone. And so we were starting to see more people create things with computers. And it also ushered in this feeling of like creating things with computers that felt a little bit more natural, trying to bring the human element back in. Let's see if I can find examples of what I'm talking about. Yeah, these are not really what I want. These are all like, I think I know what I want. 90s grunge. There we go. I had to work my way through to the right words, right? But we started to see stuff like this, right? We saw this grunge, and so much of it was using kind of printed text, right? And things that we could create with a computer. We're seeing the use of computer graphics and manipulated images and like things that are very clearly done using this new tech, but it feels super human, right? Like we are starting to bring in all of these kind of mishmash of things. Yeah, right? There's a great one specifically about typography, where we're seeing this like contrast of things that we can create using computers and the new technology that more and more people are having available, and this feeling of wanting it to feel messy, to feel imperfect, to feel very human. Type can be used in so many different ways, right? Like this to me is so cool because it's using these more modern, right? Like these serif typefaces. It's mixing them with handwriting. It's mixing them with like typewriter style monospace. It's mixing with, things that are clearly handwritten and images that are manipulated, and it feels personal, feels human, which is so cool. I was going to try and go back, but I've clicked on too many things. We're just going to have to move forward at this point. But I think it's important to remember, right, that you're never really limited by what's available to you. This is so cool, A. But B, right, like, these are pretty basic typefaces. If you were to look at this, like, this looks like a pretty standard, that looks like, honestly, maybe even like a Helvetica or Arial. Right, like, if you were to look at that typeface, you'd be like, maybe a little boring, even, right? Like, you're kind of like, yeah, it's a sans serif, it's pretty geometric sans serif. It's something you've probably seen 1,000 times in 1,000 places. But it's totally up to you how you use that and make it interesting. You can always make something interesting. But that being said, your options are not limited, right? Like, You don't have to use Helvetica for everything. And in fact, you shouldn't. It's not going to be the right fit for everything. So the other difficult part of working with typefaces is trying to figure out which one you actually want. And sometimes when you are faced with if you go to Google Fonts, you're going to be, of course I'm still in images, you're going to be just overwhelmed, right? Like, we are talking thousands upon thousands upon thousands of available free typefaces that you could just scroll through it. Any one of these you can throw into your project and use immediately. Like, it is incredible what is available to us at our fingertips right now. So, sorry if you can hear my dog. He's losing his mind downstairs about something, but I'm not going to be able to find out. When you have this many choices, it can really help to start narrowing it down. And using those kind of categories that we talked about is a great way to do that, right? So here you kind of see these are a bunch of the things that we just talked about. Serif, sans serif, displays, handwriting. I didn't talk about monospace, but sure, why not? Let's talk about monospace. You already know it because you code, and this looks like what's in every IDE. So monospace typefaces come from the literal idea every character takes up the same amount of width, right? Like, regardless of whether it is thick or thin, the spacing is going to be identical in a true monospace. The spacing is identical for each character. So an I will take up the same width as a W, right? Whereas in non-monospace fonts, you'll see the kind of thicks and thins, right? So an I only takes up this much space, whereas a D is going to be much wider and W is going to be wider than that. We use monospace fonts in text editors and in your console and stuff because it works really well for keeping track of tabs, spacing, and numbers, all of which are obviously super important when you code, right? So trying to indent stuff and trying to figure out the spacing just right in a font where the spacing for each letter is a little bit different, actual nightmare. So we don't do that. We use typefaces where the spacing is exactly the same. That being said, when you know what you're looking for, right, you can start to narrow this down. So if you're like, I'm looking for something that will be a little bit flashy, I want something of like a big fun header font that I'm going to throw all the way at the very top. So I'm going to narrow that down. I'm going to say just displays, right? And I already know, right, I'm going to be doing this in, I'm just going to try and find English. Is that not on here? I guess that's like default. And then, right, you can start to narrow it down with thickness and thinness, right? Thickness, I want it chunky, you know, and I want it, whatever. Then you've taken this like overwhelming amount of options and you've thrown it through the funnel and you've gotten yourself into a place where you can choose from a variety of options that are all going to feel pretty right. You know, I highly recommend trying to kind of narrow things down and think about what you want and what you're trying to communicate and what you're hoping for, and using that to kind of narrow the pool a little bit, right? So at minimum, your typeface should not be working against what you're saying, right? So if you're trying to communicate that something, you're making a label for like, farm fresh jam or something, right? You're not going to want something that feels super digital and super corporate. You're going to want something that feels very human, right? Very artisanal, something that communicates the idea that like this was small batch and artisan and like lovingly made, right? Whereas if you are starting a new tech company, the typeface that you wanted for the homemade jam is probably not going to cut it. So thinking about that primary message that you're trying to communicate with your design is the first way to start. Like I always try to think like, I want to make a list of words. When people look at this, what do I want them to feel? And I try to list all of those emotions out. Like, I want them to feel happy, and I want them to feel like this was made by a human, and I want them to feel like this is special or unique. I want them to feel like it's been crafted intentionally. I want them to feel like there's only so much of it. It's limited, you know? And I just brainstorm. I just do word associations and I write all of that down. And then when I'm looking at typefaces, I have that list of kind of things and I can run that against whatever I'm looking at. I'm like, well, does this typeface feel like it, you know, like it's special? Does this typeface feel like something unique? Does this typeface feel like something handmade? And kind of, you know, see if it checks the box. Beyond just the emotional, though, you gotta start thinking about where and how that typeface will be used, right? Is it gonna be large? Is it gonna be small? Is it header text? Is it body text? Is it pull quote text? And a lot of these, you know, especially as a developer, you can start to think about, like, what are you gonna assign this to your H1, H2, H3? Is this a P tag? Is this a, you know, block quote? All of those things you can start to directly associate with the code that you're gonna write. You know, and that can help you break it down a little bit more. Kind of think about it in the ways that you'll be coding with it. So when you're looking at something, you think like, man, do I really want this to be every single H3, you know, or every single place I write a P tag, or every single place I do whatever. Think about the tag that you're going to attach that to in your CSS, and that can help you kind of visualize the page in a way that maybe you wouldn't have if you were just trying to thinking about design ambiguously, right? The other thing you have to kind of keep in mind is how physically close will the user be to the content while they're reading it, right? So there's a big difference between type that you're setting for something that's going to show up on a phone, right? Because people hold a phone usually here, inches from the face. Whereas a laptop can be something a little bit further away, whereas a billboard or a presentation that you're making at a conference, that's going to be stuff that's way, way, way out. You might be able to get away with something that's a little bit less readable if you know it's something a user is going to be seeing like up close all the time, right? So if you're designing a literal, like a mobile app, you know that's not going to be it's not going to be on a desktop, it's not going to be whatever. Then you can maybe take some more liberties. You can use some more kind of funky display fonts or whatever, because you know someone's always going to be about, you know, this far from whatever they're reading. Whereas if this is a web app, then there's a possibility that it'll be on a second monitor, right? So you can't see touching my second monitor or my actual monitor. Those are arm's length away for me. So that's kind of, now we got to think a little bit more about sizes. We got to think about legibility. We got to think about kind of, we got to think about being able to literally read it in a way that maybe we didn't have to as much when we knew someone was always going to be holding it right here. And yeah, even more so if you know that's going to be on a projector, on a screen behind you. You know, if you're designing something for a digital billboard, if you're designing, you know, whatever, all sorts of stuff. All sorts of stuff that might be far away. Then your text size needs to get way bigger. Your text needs to get way simpler. You need to really kind of think about that legibility, right? So that's one of those things, and I think I've ranted on here a little bit before about the difference between art and design, right? So design always has to communicate a message. And whatever aesthetic choices that we're making are secondary to that function of communication. Whereas art isn't necessarily bound in the same way. We're able to like make art for art's sake and do things with art, make aesthetic choices because they're interesting, because they're challenging, you know. But what they communicate is secondary to the form, not the other way around. Whereas design function is always king. So even if you have to sacrifice something that you think looks a little bit more interesting or a little bit more challenging or unique, that's okay. that's better even. Because design is meant to be communicating. And so if you're not communicating something clearly, then the design is ineffective. You failed at that task. Circling back to choosing typefaces. I'm just going to be on a bunch of tangents this morning, evidently. Had just one too many cups of coffee, I guess. But another thing you have to keep in mind, right, is that kind of differentiation we talked a little bit about before between that very human, emotional kind of communication or something that feels a little bit more mechanical and precise. And that's often something that can help you choose between those two big categories, your serifs and your sans serifs. So if you're looking for something that feels a little bit more human, a little bit more natural, right? Leaning towards those humanist, like the early humanist typefaces, that can be really good. Leaning towards your serif typefaces can be really good. Leaning towards a script typeface can be really good in those situations. Whereas if you're like, right, a bank or a lawyer or a university, you probably don't want things to feel, wishy-washy, human emotional. You kind of want them to feel like a trustworthy institution, you know? And in that situation, you might lean towards things that are a little bit more modern, towards that sans serif. You might lean towards just kind of transitional typefaces, things that are a little less playful, right? So like this, not a great choice for a bank. I don't think you'd put your money in a bank that had this as their logo. Whereas, maybe you would for something like this, or that's pretty much it on this one. What have I got set? Why am I not seeing very many? There we go. So I've got display. Right. So yeah, if your bank looks like this, you're probably like, yeah, okay. Your bank starts to look like whatever this, you're probably like, no, I don't think I want to hand you my life savings. That idea of trustworthiness and kind of what we think about when we think about trust and the associations that we have with trust are all very important, right? And the feeling from your user. So we have to be very thoughtful about what we are designing, what we are conveying, what we are representing. I was trying to think if there was anything else I had to rant about. And I think I've gotten to the end of my typeface-based rants. So thank you to those that have tuned in to hang out, to nerd out a little bit about design. As always, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. You can find me on Twitter at Kathryn Grayson. Otherwise, Aztec in here trolling. Comic Sans for the win. So here, no, you've evoked one more rant from me before I sign off. Comic Sans gets such a bad rap, right? Like, that is one of the most hated fonts. And for those of you that don't know what we're talking about, I'm gonna pull it up. Maybe if I can find my URL bar. Here we go. Comic Sans, right? We're talking about this, which everybody hates, right? But, right, like here, this does actually, gives a good background. It was designed for a children's user interface, right? Like, it wasn't meant for the ways in which people have abused it. It wasn't meant to be used in, like, whatever. All these signs and, like, official documents. Like, Comic Sans has been horribly misused. But if you were to see this in a children's book or in something playful, in a literal comic, like, you wouldn't hate it. It would feel right. It would feel normal. There's I don't want to take it off the wall. I've got a poster hanging in my office. I'm just gonna pick up this, see if we can give you a view of it. There we go. You can see it a little bit here, the one with the glasses. Forgive the glare, right? That's using Comic Sans. And it was done by a professor of mine in college. He did it as a challenge because everyone was like, ew, Comic Sans, right? And so he was on a mission to see if he could use it well, and he did, because he took this kind of comic bubble approach and he used it in a very limited capacity as a funky display font. And so there's only 5 words set in Comic Sans, and it works really well. So there is no such thing as bad typefaces. There's just bad designers. There's just bad ways to use typefaces. There's my closing rant for today. Thank you, Aztec, for giving me something strong, a powerful emotion to close out on. Any of these typefaces can be used or misused. It's just up to you. And being able to judge the situation right? And the context is the job of the designer. And so the more you kind of practice and the more you think critically about type when you encounter it in the world, the better you will get at being able to make choices that don't make people create graphics like that. On that note, I'm signing off for today, y'all. I hope you guys have a great day. Hope you have a great week. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you guys soon. Later, y'all.